the total chaos. There was a period in China that many directors in the modern time avoid making movies of, not because it was chaotic and brutal, but because choosing the main character in this period was nearly impossible due to how immoral, treacherous, and short the lifespan of the presumed main character is. From 907 to 979 AD, the Five Dynasties and Ten Kingdoms era was a 70-year glitch in reality where the main characters were deleted faster than the audience could learn their names. It began in 907 AD when the warlord, Zhu Wen, liquidated the Tang dynasty. To celebrate, he rounded up the country's top 30 scholars at the White Horse Bridge and drowned them all in the Yellow River, claiming that since they were the pure stream of society, they should purify the water. But the bloodshed was just getting started. In 913 AD, the cycle of betrayal turned inward when Zhu Wen's own son stabbed him to death in his bed to steal the crown, only to be overthrown himself shortly after. By 923 AD, the later Tang seized power, but their king was so obsessed with acting in operas that he ignored his starving army until they revolted and killed him with a stray arrow during a palace riot. The most controversial geopolitical move happened in 936 AD when Shi Jingtang literally sold the 16 prefectures, the empire's only defensive wall, to the northern Khitan invaders just to buy an army to crown himself. This created a relentless meat grinder in the north, where generals became kings on Monday and corpses by Friday, while the south became a doomed paradise of silk and poetry, completely oblivious to the fact that the Song dynasty was rising in 960 AD to unify the shattered pieces of the country through fire and iron. It wasn't just a war, it was a total collapse of human loyalty where even your own shadow couldn't be trusted. The soup that deleted history. In 1899 AD, a scholar named Wang Yirong was suffering from a brutal case of malaria and was desperate for a cure. He bought a batch of dragon bones from a local pharmacy to grind into a traditional healing soup, but right before he dropped them into the boiling water, he found tiny, mysterious carvings scratched into the bone shards. He and his colleagues figured out these weren't dragons at all. They were oracle bones, the literal save files of the Shang dynasty, circa 1200 BC, and the first evidence of Chinese writing. This discovery was a massive shock because, until that moment, the Shang dynasty was treated by the world as a total fairy tale, a myth made up by historians that nobody actually believed was real. The traumatizing truth is that for over 3,000 years, people had been digging up the only proof that their civilization even began and selling it as medicine, meaning generations had been pooping out their own history and dissolving the empire's greatest secrets in stomach acid. The Mercury God. In 210 BC, the Emperor Qin Shi Huang became obsessed with immortality and began chugging mercury daily, believing this liquid silver would turn him into an indestructible god. Instead, the chemicals rotted his brain, turning him into a paranoid wreck who spent his final days shooting arrows at imaginary sea monsters. When he finally died at 49, his body decomposed so fast that his advisors had to hide the stench by surrounding his carriage with carts of rotting fish. Even in death, the nightmare lived on. He was buried in a tomb protected by the terracotta army and surrounded by flowing rivers of pure mercury. To this day, his burial chamber remains unopened because it is a chemical wasteland still too toxic to touch 2,000 years later. The Human Swine. If you think your ex was toxic or a total nightmare, Empress Gao of Han makes them look like a saint. In 194 BC, she proved that a simple rivalry wasn't enough for her late husband's favorite concubine, Lady Qi. Instead of a petty argument, she subjected the girl to a transformation that stripped away her sight, her mobility, and her ability to speak, leaving her unable to do anything but make muffled, grunting noises. She then tossed the living victim into a dark, filthy pit and nicknamed her the Human Swine. The most messed up part? She actually invited her own son, the new emperor, to come and see the creature she had created. The sight was so psychologically shattering that the young man suffered a total mental breakdown, gave up on ruling entirely, and spent the rest of his life hiding in a dark room until he died of pure grief. The 13,000-mile human graveyard. If you think your construction job is rough, imagine working on a project where the boss literally uses his employees as building materials. In 210 BC, the first emperor Qin Shi Huang obsessed over building a massive shield to keep out invaders, but he didn't care how many lives it cost to get the job done. He forced nearly 400,000 people into a labor system so brutal that when workers collapsed from exhaustion, they weren't given a funeral, they were simply tossed into the foundation and paved over with stone. Today, this wonder of the world is known as the world's longest graveyard, a 13,000-mile human monument where tourists are literally stepping on the remains of the people who died building it. The Drunken Bone. In 654 AD, the first and the only female emperor to rule China, Wu Zetian performed a crime so cold-blooded it makes modern thrillers look like cartoons. To eliminate her main rival, Empress Wang, she allegedly strangled her own newborn daughter and waited for the emperor to find the body. Since the empress was the last person to visit the nursery, the blame fell entirely on her, and she was immediately thrown into a dungeon. But the nightmare truly began after Wu took the crown. To ensure her enemies could never return, she subjected the former empress and a rival consort to the drunken bone punishment. She had them stripped of their limbs and submerged in massive vats of high-proof wine. She mockingly told them to soak to the bone as they were left to slowly perish in the alcohol over several agonizing days. The Jar of Shame. Between 1400 and 1912, becoming a eunuch meant undergoing a surgery so brutal that the surgeon would ask you 3 times if you were sure before the first cut. If you didn't hesitate, your manhood was removed and preserved in a special container known as a bao. These jars weren't just trophies, they were a literal ticket to the afterlife. In ancient Chinese culture, it was believed that your ancestors wouldn't recognize you if you arrived incomplete. This meant if you lost your jar, you were doomed to wander as a shameful ghost for eternity. Eunuchs guarded these containers like their souls depended on it, often hanging them from the ceiling of their quarters to show their status and completeness. The most disturbing part? If a jar was lost, stolen, or destroyed, a eunuch would spend his entire life savings on the black market to buy someone else's hearts. They were so terrified of being rejected by their spirits that they would rather be buried with a stranger's remains just to trick the gatekeepers of the afterlife into letting them in. The Gateway to Hell. In the past, getting a government job didn't just require a resume, it required surviving a psychological death trap known as the Imperial Exam. Thousands of candidates were locked into stone cells the size of a small closet for 3 to 9 days straight. Once the doors were bolted, you weren't allowed to leave for any reason. You ate, slept, and lived in your own waste in that one tiny box while trying to write perfect poetry and political essays. The pressure was so soul-crushing that these cells were nicknamed the Gateway to Hell. Under the extreme heat and isolation, men would regularly suffer total mental collapses, hallucinating that the vengeful ghosts of their ancestors were screaming in their ears. It wasn't uncommon for candidates to suffer strokes or heart attacks right in the middle of a sentence. The most disturbing part? If a student died during the test, the guards wouldn't stop the exam or even notify the family. To avoid contaminating the sacred grounds with death, they would simply wrap the body in a straw mat and toss it over the back wall of the compound like a piece of garbage. The other candidates were forced to keep writing their exams, knowing their competition was literally being thrown out with the trash just a few feet away. If you like this video, hit that thumbs up and subscribe.